Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the Bookish podcast. Sorry for the delay on this episode. I ran into some discomfort with continuing, frankly. I thought I'd peaked at episode 2 because I shared one of the most personal and sincere things I've ever written, and I didn't know if my fiction could really follow up. That said, I'm going to share it anyway. Hopefully it has some value to people. I mean, it's still meaningful to me, so I figure it might be meaningful to somebody else. Also, the editing for this one took forever. I lost my voice doing the readings, and I could never get the music to sync up. So I just decided to abandon music unless I have time for it, because it really cut into my actual writing time over the last 2 weeks. Now, for some news. First, the music is optional now. Second, this is now officially a podcast. I am on iTunes or wherever you find your podcasts. You can look me up as Joe Bookish. I think it's the Joe Bookish podcast, 3 words. Oh, third, we'll be breaking this thing into seasons now. So I'm going to do, and I think I mentioned this last episode, but I'm going to do 6 episodes, so 6 weeks, ideally, for stories, and then 6 weeks of a break so I can produce. I'm going to try to tighten up these intros because I noticed, well, one of my coworkers noticed that I used a lot of filler language, and I want to cut that out. So I'm going to, following a script. Now for this week's story, this is called Mark Lives. It's about a kid debating suicide. Something I have some experience with, I'm going to be honest. Having lived a little hard as a kid, I guess, from my teens to my early 20s, I spent my mid-20s debating whether it was worth pushing forward. This is actually intended to be funnier, rather on the funny side. But it really is about where we find meaning in our lives and what pushes us to keep going. What makes life worth living? I think every day is a choice, and what you do with the time you give yourself every morning or every night is what makes this experience worth the time. In retrospect, I think it's a pretty large oversimplification of adulthood. It kind of juxtapose 2 lifestyles, but they are, of course, like caricatures of people I may or may not know. If you recognize yourself, I don't think working in a bookstore and writing is actually a feasible lifestyle. I think maybe some people would disagree, but generally speaking, I don't think you're going to have an apartment on whatever, 20 grand a year or whatever that might be. I met a guy yesterday at the laundromat. This is not on the script, but I met a guy yesterday at the laundromat who was pushing probably mid-60s, and he was waiting for the bus, but it left without him. Like, it just drove past on the street, and it was a very sobering moment for me to realize, like, well, I'm living a pretty charmed life writing stories about a guy who, wants to quit his office job and write. Frankly, I love my office job. Don't get me wrong. It's just, personal fulfillment or whatever. I think it's funny how perspective changes over the course of your life. When you're not broke, you don't realize how bad broke life is, even if you've experienced being broke. One last note. I actually stole a line from my favorite podcast. It's called the Nightmare Magazine podcast. The guy introduces every story by saying, "Without further ado," and he says the name of the story. I don't want to say "without further ado" anymore because that's, some kind of theft, plagiarism, I guess. So I'm going to work on a line. I'll have to figure that out. In the meantime, this is Mark Lives. Thank you. Mark listened to TV static and tried to think. The sound wasn't coming from a television. He didn't think TVs even made that noise anymore, not after the switch to digital a few years earlier. He didn't even know what switch to digital meant for TV static. He didn't know where static came from, but he imagined it was an analog thing. He'd actually looked up the noise on his phone so he could block out the conversations and clatter going on around him. He needed to think, but he didn't want to be alone. After jumping into his car and driving to a public place, the first public place with comfortable chairs, he bought a coffee and settled in. There, in a big puffy coffee shop chair situated between end tables and one of those knee-wrecking center tables littered with magazines, Mark questioned whether or not he should continue living. It hadn't been a bad life. His parents were together, he was in his third year of college, he had a little sister who hooked up to him, and a dog that sat in a ball in his lap when Mark read or watched movies. In general, Mark was pretty happy. He just felt as though the whole thing, life, was maybe meaningless. The feeling had been with Mark for a very long time, about as far back as he could remember. In the chair, he recalled overlooked moments from his childhood where he'd stare closely at window blinds in his kitchen to watch the light glance off of dust motes as they bobbled in the air. He'd forget himself and breathe gently so they'd hang motionless, suspended by nothing. He felt that those nothing moments were probably the defining feature of his life. Happy times always felt like stirrings, deviations from a standard, something much more still or idle. The same was true for his sad moments, the breakups and injuries and losses. They comprised a spectrum of experience that invariably came back to a middle, to the parts he forgot up to that moment, the nothingness. Maybe death, which seemed like distilled nothingness, might be a better alternative to all this searching and effort. Stumbling through abstractions like purpose and meaning, he considered his friends and their lives. Mark only had two close friends, one who'd been around forever and one who'd been around for a really long time. They hadn't grown up together. Mark spent most of his childhood and adolescence alone, passing time reading, writing, walking around, and trying to watch dust motes with varying degrees of success. But his friends came into and out of his life as their own lives allowed. Sometimes they were around every day, and other times they vanished for months. It had given Mark the opportunity to see his friends grow in spurts. There were profoundly religious phases, agnostic phases, atheistic phases, rock phases, rap phases, country phases, fit phases, fat phases, dog phases, cat phases, long hair phases, spiky phases, short hair phases, a sunglasses phase that never ended, jewelry phases, homeless phases, business casual phases, professional phases, and a number of other phases that didn't merit much attention. Friend A was largely the safe friend, and friend B tended to chase dreams and face consequences. Homeless phases belonged exclusively to friend B. Business casual phases were all friend A. Fat and fit phases applied to both. Friend A, who had graduated college after only 2 years by taking AP classes and college courses through every season from junior year of high school through his last year in college, had found a job doing web design for a large and popular media company. He had a house, had a car, good credit, and a girlfriend he liked most of the time. Friend A lived a life of intense predictability so ludicrously thorough that you could plan to hang out with him weeks in advance without ever consulting him. Mark generally considered this the best route to hanging out with friend A, as this friend, his oldest friend by nearly a decade, would sometimes make up excuses to avoid hanging out if he had advanced warning. Friend A drove to work, worked, went home, got high, and either watched TV or played video games just about every night he wasn't hanging out with his girlfriend. Girlfriend A would come over on Tuesday and during the day on Saturday to sleep over, and she'd leave between 4 and 6 p.m. on Sunday. Friend A would occasionally take Girlfriend A on trips to Colorado or Florida during summer and winter because he had money for it. Sometimes he went and caught games at bars during basketball season because that was how people made friends and cemented bonds in Mark's hometown. Friend A always mentioned those events ahead of time whenever he and Mark hung out. Friend A was content, Mark couldn't fault him, but that sort of predictability didn't suit Mark very well. In his mind, after a while, predictability felt like stagnation. Doing the same things every day was like digging your own grave in tiny increments, if the things you were doing weren't totally fulfilling. Mark couldn't think of any action that was perfectly fulfilling. There were too many ways a person could think and function to stay satisfied repeating any one act or even a fixed set of acts over a long period of time. Personally, Mark's fear of ennui stemmed from playing games through high school. He'd committed 500 hours to a particularly long and well-crafted RPG. Then he realized that 500 hours equates to nearly 21 days of his life, 3 weeks. And he thought about all the things he could have done in that 21 days and resolved to never play a video game again. This held true for TV as well, because Mark had been subjected to achingly long marathons of sitcoms and sci-fi programs by all of his closest relations, and had spent each moment of that time wondering what else he could have been doing besides watching one story unfold over the course of 60 hours of his life. Beyond TV and games, friend A played guitar very well, enjoyed working out on occasion, and, like Mark, he also wrote. As with Mark, friend A's interest in any of the aforementioned activities waxed and waned with life pressure. Girlfriend fight? Friend A went to TV, not creativity. Work stress? TV, not creativity. Existential plight? TV? Mark honestly didn't know what went on when friend A started asking the big questions. Television was, however, his predictable fallback. Mark knew that when he faced existential crises, he sat down to read or write, which were his primary hobbies, or he hopped onto the internet and down an hours-long rabbit hole of movies and pop culture. Friend A probably gamed. Mark paused to consider how many hours he may have spent staring blankly at screens, slumped in a chair as opposed to doing anything remotely productive, and shuddered slightly, catching the eye of a middle-aged man sitting at a window across from Mark's puffy chair. The man at the window wondered how many times he'd seen similar young men shudder in the exact same manner while sitting in puffy chairs. Then he shrugged and thought back to Walden, a book he'd read as a youth, which justified and sanctified the act of simply sitting and being. Mark hadn't read Walden, and in his rumination found the act of simply sitting and being frustrating and difficult enough to merit listening to TV static to prevent distraction. Which brought Mark back to the initial point. Was the predictable life, embodied by his friend A, whose bills were paid and who had food in the fridge and generally did things he liked to do, really all that safe? Mark thought back to his own bosses and his own work stresses and the career trajectory of people in his life. The higher up they got, the more they worked, generally speaking. Mark had never met anyone famous, but expected that, despite their superficially glamorous lifestyles, even famous people might work a lot too and feel the same insecurities regarding life and social expectation and continued existence and all the things that kept regular people up at night. And per his own experience in watching his friend, Mark knew that work stress and social stress stunted creativity. Filling whatever roles their communities required of them pulled them away from their passions and drove them to perform perfunctorily, devoting all their energy to the actions expected of them. Even people with creative jobs lost their self-expression if they were expected to create only one thing. The work and the bills and the families and continued success haunted people and stayed with them always. They weren't peaceful, they were driven. They were alienated from themselves. If safety and predictability couldn't rid them of their creeping dread, perhaps an alternate lifestyle might. Friend B used to live in his car. Friend B had also made more money than Friend A at different points in his life, and had done happy things that would never even have occurred to Friend A, like changing jobs on a whim and not going to college. Sometimes Friend B asked Mark to borrow money. Mark loaned it out fully aware he'd never get all of it back, but Mark had a little bit of Friend B's mentality in him too, and was okay with getting meals covered here and there for the rest of his life if Friend B stuck around that long. Life wasn't always about the money. Mark met Friend B in high school and had grown accustomed to Friend B's get-rich-quick schemes and cavalier attitude towards social customs and practices. Bills? Sometimes. Jobs? Sometimes. Everything else? Sure, maybe. Once, while Friend B was crashing on a couch belonging to some acquaintances, a conversation occurred wherein Friend B suggested to Mark that he drop out of college or change his major from the STEM program he'd locked himself into to something more in line with his actual interests. Mark, appalled, said that he liked having food and the idea of having his own place in the future. He wanted a decent job and to not worry about bills, which his family had struggled to keep up with through Mark's adolescence. Friend B, sensing the hostility, dropped the subject and went back to watching offensive internet videos. Mark replayed the conversation in his mind many times, allowing the ideas to ferment. What if he dropped out or became an English major, which, besides advanced courses, were the bane of every STEM student's existence? He weighed the options. With his technical knowledge and his sweet-ass degree, he'd get out of college and make $60,000 per year starting. He could buy a nice house and all the musical instruments and books he wanted, plus pay his bills and have food and support a relationship. He'd work 20 years, retire early and maybe rich, and have the rest of his life to engage in creative activities and child-rearing. Until then, he'd face long office hours and heavy pressure to perform to company, any company really, standards. He'd also risk separation from his family unit and alienation from his non-work communities, as had most of the STEMers Mark had seen graduate and enter into their respective fields. They basically turned their brains off after work and went to bars or went home and watched TV. With Friend B's course of action, he could learn how to write well, maybe get a job in a bookstore if he were lucky, he'd always wanted to do that, and he could write all the time. He'd probably need roommates, maybe a girl with a stable income would take him in like a stray and they could struggle their way into becoming a family the same way Mark's parents had. Though they fought constantly, his parents really loved each other, he thought, and they'd probably look back on their lives warmly when they got old. Mark thought to Friend B's current living arrangement, an apartment somewhere shady afforded by restaurant work, which friend B developed a real passion for over the years, and thought about his own living situation. A dorm with a roommate in a nice part of town, where he could maybe leave a door unlocked without fearing missing stuff upon his return, and resolved to never ever stress for money again. And he didn't really want to fight with his significant other over bills. Poverty didn't seem to promote balance either, being that society was propelled by currency. Worry haunted the poor like stress haunted the rich. Was it possible to live in a state where he could maybe maintain a family, pay his bills, and potentially be successful? Mark didn't want to spend life shifting across the spectrum of experience, reveling in small victories and wallowing in his defeats. That seemed like fruitless labor, a dead end. He wanted to sit and be, as the window guy had put it, unbeknownst to Mark. If he couldn't figure out how to simply be, life wasn't worth the effort. Could there be a job that would pay well enough for Mark to survive without so much soul-crushing effort? Maybe one where he could stop advancing and really settle into a role without anyone freaking out about him not moving up? In corporate culture, Mark didn't think so. Companies sloughed off employees like bodies sloughed off cells. Regardless of their performance, employees only ever lasted so long in one role before being replaced by a ladder climber who'd work for less. Also, Mark didn't want to commit 8 hours per day to work he didn't care about. Could he find work he cared about? Yes, definitely. So maybe he could get into a role that would provide him with rewarding work that maybe wasn't too draining, granting him the freedom of expression he required to be happy at home. Could he be a teacher? Maybe. But he'd be terribly afraid of screwing a kid up. Then again, he could accidentally trip a kid in the coffee shop and the kid could hit his head on a chair and forget math or something. He imagined he could really mess a kid up anywhere, maybe kids were just fragile. Realistically, he was young enough to get onto a rewarding path. He could maybe do programming? It always felt natural and was easy enough to not leave him worn out at the end of the day, barring some occasionally excruciating debugging. Did life really come down to your job anyway? That didn't seem right. Maybe it was something more nebulous, like living until he found a calling and then embracing that calling and simply being happy doing that thing and enjoying whatever living situation the calling would provide. That seemed reasonable, if a little scary in the friend B kind of way. Maybe it wasn't about chasing a calling, just being observant, reflecting on the things he came back to over and over as days cycled into years, the baseline that maybe isn't nothing, but natural instead. Like picking up a pen and paper or typing out a story, sitting down with a math problem or making beautiful, intricate machines, or taking pictures or making movies, things that we all typically love for a while and lose and forget existed. Maybe life was really in keeping those things and sharing them with others to affect them and influence the way they approached their own passions. Maybe life was about stressing the other stuff less, the things people debate like big expenses and commitments. Maybe things that merit debate weren't really worth stressing over at all. We all have to pay bills. Maybe it wasn't about making money as much as reducing the bills. Abstaining from those things that would force Mark to need a busy job and spend his best years removed from himself. Mark didn't know that he'd always want to write, but he knew that he'd always written. He knew he wanted money for bills, but that maintaining a nuclear family, buying a house, a new car, having cable, and eating out all the time really didn't matter all that much, personally. He just knew that that's what happy people were supposed to do. But supposition wasn't always right. Would he really be happy in the career he was lining up for? Probably not. Did he want to do it for 20 years? Definitely not. Could he write and make money? Probably not. But he was happiest sitting back with a book or a pen and some paper. Could he support a family on bookstore and freelance income? Probably not. But that didn't necessarily mean he had to go without kids. If he were happy, he'd be a good dad and he'd have time for his family. Maybe he'd meet someone who'd be happy like he was, without new cars and cable and a big house, etc. And they could make something work. Who knew? But he'd write it out doing the things he could lose himself in, whatever floated ahead, naturally.